There was a young man called Stephen Grant. Stephen had bizarre sleep habits where he would always tie one of his legs and make sure that he had locked every inch of his apartment. It seemed like he did all of those things because he was often walking around when he was asleep. Because of his bizarre sleep habits, Stephen often chose not to sleep at all. He chose to spend all night to read some books or play Rubik's Cube instead. Every day, Stephen worked at a museum by selling souvenirs there. He was known as an introverted, quiet, and reserved person. The only person who always listened to him attentively was a statue at the central area of the city. After Stephen finished working, he returned to his apartment and repeated all of his bizarre sleep habits as usual. When he was asleep, he was suddenly dreaming of being in another world. In his dream, he heard a mysterious voice that came from inside of his head. That mysterious voice told Stephen to surrender his body to Mark.
Go back to sleep, worm.
Oh, that was weird. What happened? Where are you?
Surrender the body to Mark.
Stephen was confused when he heard that. He didn't understand what that mysterious voice meant. In his confusion, suddenly he was chased by a group of mysterious people. He ran away from them immediately and disguised himself as one of the citizens. In that place, he was watching a cult meeting which was led by a middle-aged man called Arthur Harrow. In the middle of that cult meeting, Harrow was approached by one of his subordinates. His subordinate told him that there was an imposter among them. Because Stephen didn't belong to that group, he was caught by everybody there immediately. Strangely, Harrow recognized Stephen's face straight away. He said that Stephen was a mercenary. After everybody heard that, they gave Stephen suspicious, hostile glances. Then, Harrow asked Stephen to give an object called the scarab to him. Surprisingly, the object that he asked was found inside of Stephen's pocket of jacket. Since Stephen was clueless about that object, he tried to give it to Harrow right away. But suddenly, his body acted as if it refused to give that object to Harrow. It seemed like Stephen's body was controlled by another person. Because of this, Harrow told his subordinates to catch Stephen. Then, another strange incident happened. Suddenly, Stephen lost his consciousness for a second. Then, he woke up and found himself had beaten up all of Harrow's subordinates in the next second. After that, he managed to escape from them by using a truck. But apparently, Harrow's subordinates were still chasing him. The same strange incident then happened. Stephen lost his consciousness for a second and found himself had beaten up one of Harrow's subordinates in the next second. Those strange incidents kept happening until finally Stephen woke up from his sleep. Stephen was relieved when he realized that those strange incidents were only a dream. When he went outside, he was surprised when he found out that he had been sleeping for 2 days. Then, he saw something strange inside of his apartment. After he removed the strange board, he found a cellular phone and an apartment key inside of the mysterious hole. Suddenly, the cellular phone rang. Stephen answered the call instantly. As soon as Stephen answered the call, a woman's voice was heard yelling at him and calling him Mark. Then, the call suddenly ended. Stephen heard another mysterious voice which was calling his name. He was walking toward the source of that mysterious voice. He was surprised when he realized that the mysterious voice came from a mirror that was hung on his bathroom's wall. Suddenly, the atmosphere in his apartment got dark and eerie. Because of that, Stephen decided to run away immediately. Stephen saw a scary-looking creature chasing him from behind. Then, he screamed and realized that he was inside of a bus.
Thank you. Isn't it?
It seemed like what Stephen had just experienced was only his hallucination. After that, Stephen went to the museum to work as usual. Surprisingly, he met Harrow again there. He called a security guard right away, but apparently, that security guard was one of Harrow's followers. Suddenly, Stephen faced a difficult situation. He was surrounded by Harrow and many of his followers. Their purpose of meeting Stephen there was still the same. They wanted to take the scarab from Stephen. When Stephen was alone at the museum, Harrow sent a scary-looking animal there to scare Stephen. Stephen got frightened and ran away immediately. Then, he hid in a toilet. When he was in the toilet, he heard another voice from inside of his head. This time, that voice showed his body which appeared on the mirror in the toilet. That voice's body looked exactly as same as Stephen, but he had totally different personality. Apparently, he was the one who was called Mark, the man who had been targeted by Harrow. He was also the man who had saved Stephen when he was chased by Harrow's subordinates. Then, Mark told Stephen to surrender his body if they wanted to survive. As soon as Stephen's body was taken over, Stephen turned into a creature called Moon Knight. Moon Knight beat up that scary-looking animal to death with his superpower. Turned out, Stephen suffered from dissociative identity disorder. He had another distinct personality identity called Mark. Mark was a son of the god of the moon called Khonshu. Khonshu granted Marc superpower that enabled him to be extremely strong when he turned into Moon Knight. So, that was a little explanation about the relation between Marc and Steven. The next day, Steven woke up and found himself had returned to his apartment. As he arrived at the museum, he asked his friend to go to a control room with him to see whether what happened to him last night was real or not. Steven told his friend that he had to damage a toilet at that museum because he was chased by a wild animal last night. But turned out, everything that he had experienced last night didn't appear on the CCTV footages. Instead, the CCTV footages only showed Steven, who was running by himself like a madman. There was no wild animal or anything that was chasing him. Because Steven had damaged some facilities and properties at that museum, he was finally fired from his job. After that, Steven was looking for an apartment which had the key that matched with the key that he had found in his apartment. He was told that it was Marc's apartment. As Steven arrived at a building, he was told to go to a storage room. He found a bag that contained money, weapons, and passport which were owned by Marc there. Steven realized that Marc's face was identical to his face. Steven also found the scarab which had been targeted by Harrow inside of the bag. Then, Marc appeared through the mirror reflection. Marc told Steven to surrender his body because he had to do a very important mission that time. When Steven heard that, he refused to surrender his body. He decided to run away instead. When Steven got out of that storage room, he was stopped by Khonshu. Khonshu told Steven to surrender his body to Marc. Steven refused to surrender his body, so he ran away from him. When he managed to get out of that building, he encountered a woman there. Apparently, that woman was Marc's wife. She was the one who called Steven on phone last day. She was called Layla. Layla thought that Steven was Marc, but then, she took Steven to his apartment. As they arrived at Steven's apartment, Steven explained everything to Layla. He told her that he wasn't Marc. Then, he showed her the belongings inside of Marc's bag, including the scarab that he had found there. Steven hadn't finished explaining everything to Layla when two detectives came to his apartment. Because of that, Layla had to climb the window to hide outside. Then, those two detectives arrested Steven for identity document forgery after they found Marc's passport in Steven's apartment. They thought that Steven was trying to forge his identity. After that, they handcuffed Steven and brought him somewhere. Turned out, Steven wasn't brought to the police station. He was brought to a strange place instead. Apparently, those two detectives were Harrow's followers. Then, Marc appeared and told Steven to surrender his body. Steven still refused to surrender his body. After that, Harrow came and approached Steven. He talked to Steven gently and said that he had understood Steven's condition. He said that he knew that Steven actually had nothing to do with Marc and Khonshu. Then, he tried to calm Steven down by asking him to walk around the village with him. When they were walking around the village, Harrow told Steven that he used to be one of Khonshu's subordinates like Marc, who was also a Khonshu's subordinate. But one day Harrow decided to stop following Khonshu and started to worship the goddess Ammit. Because of his decision, he needed the scarab to be used as a compass to find the goddess Ammit and raise her from the dead. After that, Harrow asked Steven to give the scarab to him, but Steven told him that he didn't have the scarab anymore. In the middle of that difficult situation, suddenly Layla came and showed the scarab that had been looked for by Harrow and his followers. Then, she gave the scarab to Steven and asked him to run away with her. Layla told Steven to change into his costume immediately. She still thought that Steven was Marc, who had superpower. Steven was still confused with everything, and because of that, they were running at the time. Steven was suddenly attacked by a wild animal which was sent by Harrow. But because of the attack from that wild animal, Steven finally managed to change into Moon Knight's costume like Marc, even though his Moon Knight's costume was slightly different from Marc's Moon Knight's costume. With that Moon Knight's costume, Steven tried to defeat that wild animal. Strangely, only Steven who could see that wild animal. Other people who didn't understand the situation would probably think that he was a madman.
You reckon he's having a seizure?
Because Steven was unable to defeat that wild animal, he finally decided to surrender his body to Marc so he could save himself. Then, with his superpower, Marc attacked and killed that wild animal in less than a second. After that, Marc realized that he had lost the scarab. Harrow found the scarab and took it with him. Because Marc had taken over Steven's body, he refused to return the body to Steven. He decided to take advantage of Steven's body first to complete the mission that Khonshu had given him. A couple of time later, Marc finally arrived in Egypt. He went to Egypt because he was looking for Harrow. He wanted to stop Harrow from doing his mission to raise the goddess Ammit from her dead. At the same time, Harrow and his followers had arrived at the site of the tomb of the goddess Ammit. When Marc was trying to find Harrow, he was stopped by Harrow's subordinates. Then, Marc used them to get information about the whereabouts of Harrow and his followers. But apparently, Harrow's subordinates were very faithful to Harrow. They preferred to die rather than revealing the secret information about Harrow. Because Marc failed to get any information about Harrow, he asked Khonshu about what they were going to do after this. Because Khonshu didn't have other options, he invited Harrow to attend a trial with the gods and the goddesses as the judges. Since that trial would be held in a pyramid with the gods and the goddesses as the judges, Harrow wouldn't be able to refuse to attend the trial. Before the trial began, Marc met a follower of the goddess of music called Yatzil. They were having a conversation until the trial finally took place. After that, Khonshu took over Marc's body. He accused Harrow of trying to unleash the goddess Amit. Because of that accusation, Harrow was called to give his statement. In that trial, Harrow denied everything that Khonshu had accused him of. He convinced all gods and goddesses who were present there that he wouldn't do such thing. Then, he attacked Khonshu by saying that Khonshu had used a mentally ill person to become his avatar. The trial was finally ended. All of the accusations that were stated by Khonshu were rejected by the gods and the goddesses. After the trial ended, Yatzil met Marc to tell him to find a sarcophagus that was owned by a Met J who knew about the site of the tomb of the goddess Amit. At downtown, Layla saw Marc among the crowd. She offered to help him and took him to meet Anton Mogart. Anton was Layla's acquaintance who owned a sarcophagus. Because Layla was Anton's acquaintance, Anton allowed Layla and Marc to see his sarcophagus at close range. Because Marc had zero knowledge about history, he had difficulty to find any clue, so he told Steven to do that job. After Anton saw Marc starting to behave strangely, he told his security guards to arrest Marc and Layla. In that difficult situation, Harrow suddenly came and incited Anton to hate Marc and Layla. Then, he used his superpower to steal the sarcophagus there. After that, Harrow left that place. Anton and his subordinates were ready to attack Marc and Layla, but with his superpower, Marc finally managed to defeat Anton and all of his subordinates. After the fight with Anton and his subordinates was over, Steven took over his body to find the answer from the clues that they had found before. Luckily, Layla managed to steal some clues before Harrow stole the sarcophagus. After they solved a little clue, Khonshu and Moon Knight worked together to change the sky into how it was in 2000 years ago. They had to do that because they needed to match their clues with the constellations at that time. Unfortunately, the gods and the goddesses were angry because of what Khonshu was doing, so they decided to punish Khonshu by locking him up inside of a rock. After Khonshu was gone, Steven lost his superpower and fell unconscious immediately. Harrow was being brought by one of the gods who had imprisoned Khonshu. Harrow was relieved when he found out that Khonshu was being locked up inside of a rock because it meant that there was nobody who would stop him from doing his mission anymore. Layla was trying to save Steven because Harrow's subordinates suddenly came to that place to look for them. Because Steven was still unconscious, Layla had to find a way to survive by herself so she could save Steven and herself. Luckily, Layla was used to face such difficult situation. She got inside of a car immediately to hide and create a plan to fight Harrow's subordinates. She took a dynamite in that car and threw it to the car of Harrow's subordinates. After that, Steven woke up from his fainting. Then, Steven and Layla stole a car and rode it to look for Harrow. Not long after that, they arrived at the site of the tomb of the goddess Amit. Before they went inside of that tomb, they took some equipment that they might need later with them. Before they found the coffin of the goddess Amit, they soon realized that the tomb was built like a labyrinth which had a shape of the Eye of Horus. They also realized that there were a lot of blood from recent time and human remains inside of that tomb. Then, Steven and Layla went to different ways to find an exit from that labyrinth. When they were walking in different ways, an Egyptian priest suddenly went inside of that tomb. He carried a body of a dying human with him. Then, that Egyptian priest cut up that dying human's body there. After that, he removed and took the internal organs of that poor human one by one. From above, Steven saw Layla and realized that she was in danger, so he helped Layla to run away from that place by distracting the Egyptian priest. After that, Layla and Steven got separated. Layla ran as quickly as she could until she almost fell into an abyss. She was trying to cross the abyss by walking on a narrow brittle path at the side of the abyss. Unluckily, when Layla almost arrived on the other side, the Egyptian priest found and caught her. Layla fought that Egyptian priest with everything she had until she finally managed to throw that priest into the bottom of the abyss. When Layla was about to leave that place, she saw Harrow there. Apparently, Harrow had been watching her since she arrived there. Harrow told Layla that he was really amazed by her. He also mentioned about Layla's late father called Abdullah El Fowli. Harrow said that Layla's father was murdered by some mercenaries and Marc was one of those mercenaries. After Layla heard that story, she didn't instantly believe in what Harrow had said to her, but she couldn't deny that it was possible if that story was true. Then, Layla left that place with anger and looked for Steven. Steven arrived at the tomb of Alexander the Great. He found the statue of the goddess Amit inside of Alexander the Great's throat. Stephen was glad when he saw Layla arrived at that place. He was happy because he managed to find the statue of the goddess Ammit, but Layla was angry at Marc instead. She confronted and asked Marc about what actually happened to her late father. Then, Marc took over Stephen's body. He asked Layla to leave that place immediately. He promised to explain everything to Layla after they managed to get out of that place. But Layla forced Marc to tell her about everything right away. Finally, Marc told Layla about what actually happened. He told her that his colleague did murder her father. In fact, his colleague tried to murder everyone that time, including Marc. While Marc was explaining everything to Layla, suddenly Harrow and his subordinates came to that place. Marc told Layla to run away by herself. Meanwhile, he would try to fight Harrow and his subordinates. Unfortunately, because Marc didn't have his superpower anymore, he finally died after Harrow shot him on the chest. After that, Marc suddenly woke up in a place that was full of light. In that place, he met Harrow, who acted as if he was Marc's psychiatrist. Marc was confused with everything, so he ran away from that room and hid inside of another room. While hiding in that room, he found a coffin and saw Stephen getting out of that coffin. For the first time in their lives, Marc and Stephen finally met in different bodies. After that, they got out of that room and planned to escape from that place. While they were running away, they encountered a mysterious creature who looked like a hippopotamus. Apparently, that mysterious creature was a goddess called the goddess Taurid. The goddess Taurid said that actually Marc and Stephen had died and they were in a place between the mortal world and the afterlife, so they were still in a transition. The goddess Taurid explained that she was assigned to help the dead spirits by guiding them into the afterlife. Marc didn't believe with everything that the goddess Taurid had said. He still tried to escape from that place by opening a door there. After he opened that door, he saw a different panorama and an ancient ship in front of him. He was told that the ancient ship would be the transportation that he and Stephen would use to go to the afterlife, and it would sail across a large desert. The goddess Taurid also said that the ancient ship would take Marc and Stephen to their final destination, which was heaven or hell, and their final destination was very much depending on the result of their waiting. Then, the goddess Taurid took their hearts and put those hearts on a scale. She was confused with the result of their waiting because the scale wouldn't stop teetering. Then, she realized that this thing happened because Marc and Stephen weren't being honest to each other. There were still many secrets that they were hiding from each other. Because of that, the goddess Taurid suggested them to get back to the building and be honest to each other so they could get the proper result of their waiting. Then, Marc and Stephen finally got back to the building. Stephen saw some rooms there and realized that each of those rooms was a piece of their memories. They went inside of a room and found many corpses there. Apparently, those corpses were people who had been murdered by Marc. Unexpectedly, there was a little boy who was alive among those corpses. Stephen was wondering if that little boy was also murdered by Marc, and if he did get murdered by Marc, he wanted to know about the reason. Because Stephen was curious about that little boy, he chased that little boy right away. Marc tried to stop Stephen as if he didn't want Stephen to find out about the truth. In that place, Stephen saw his family there. There were his mother, father, the little version of himself, and also the little boy whom he had met before. He was surprised when he found out that the little boy was apparently his younger brother. As long as he remembered, he never had a younger brother in his life. Then, Stephen saw them going inside of a cave to play and followed them there. Suddenly, it rained heavily. Because of that, the cave was slowly covered with water. Stephen panicked and looked for them right away because he thought that those two little boys were trapped inside of that cave. At the same time, Marc was looking for Stephen. He finally found him inside of a room. There was a funeral inside of that room. Turned out, it was the funeral of Marc's younger brother who died because he drowned in the cave. Because of that tragedy, Marc's mother was furious at Marc. She blamed Marc for the death of his brother and said that Marc had failed to protect his brother. Marc's mother was still angry at Marc and blaming him for the death of his brother even after years since the tragedy took place. The little Marc was sick of his mother who kept blaming him, so he left that room and went to his bedroom. When Stephen was following the little Marc to his room, Marc came and took Stephen to another place. Marc didn't want Stephen to remember their dark past again. In the blink of an eye, they had moved to another place. They saw the corpse of Layla's father who had been murdered by Marc's colleague there. Apparently, Marc also got shot by his colleague. He tried to escape from that place to save himself. In that place, Marc met the god Khonshu for the first time. The god Khonshu offered to help Marc, but with one condition where Marc must become his avatar or follower. Because Marc had no other options, he accepted the offer from the god Khonshu. Then, he was slowly turning into Moon Knight. After that, Marc and Stephen returned to the place of the goddess Taurid. Then, a strange incident happened. Marc suspected that Harrow was the one behind all of this. He asked the goddess Taurid to raise him and Stephen from the dead so they could stop Harrow. The goddess Taurid said that they should balance their scale first before they could be raised from the dead. The teetering scale showed that Stephen and Marc were still hiding something from each other. After Marc heard that, he asked Stephen to go back to the building of their memories with him. Inside of a room, they saw the little Marc crying in his room because he felt sad and frustrated for being treated poorly by his mother. Because of that frustrating and traumatic feeling, Mark created another distinct personality identity. That distinct personality identity was Steven. Mark created Steven to cope with his traumatic situation where his mother was treating him unfairly. Steven was very surprised when he found out about that. All this time, he thought that he was an ordinary human being. Turned out, he was only a personality that had been created by Mark. That was why he wasn't aware that he had a younger brother, and he always thought that he had a good mother. Because Mark and Steven ran out of the time, they returned to the place of the goddess Tauret. As they arrived there, the goddess Tauret said with regret that Steven and Mark would be taken to hell because the scale that weighed their hearts was still moving unsteadily. Then, the corpses began to climb to that ship to take Steven and Mark with them. Mark and Steven didn't accept that decision, so they tried to fight all of those corpses. Unluckily, Steven fell from the ship. He got up quickly and tried to chase that ship, but his body was hard to move. Then, he was slowly turning into a stone. On the ship, suddenly the scale that weighed Steven and Mark's hearts stopped moving. It meant that Mark would be taken to heaven. When Mark arrived in heaven, he kept thinking about Steven. He thought that he didn't deserve to be put in heaven. Finally, Mark decided to go from heaven and look for Steven. As he arrived at Steven's place, he was also turning into a stone. But suddenly, a miracle happened. The gates of Osiris began to open, which caused Steven and Mark turned back into humans. Steven and Mark ran toward the gates as quickly as they could because a sandstorm was coming to that place. Meanwhile, in the mortal world, Harrow finally managed to find the statue of the goddess Ammit. After he found that statue, he became more powerful than he was before. After everybody had gone from that place, Layla got out of her hiding place and approached Mark, who was lying dead on the floor. Because of Mark's death, Layla was determined to take revenge on Harrow and kill him with her own hands. At the same time, Harrow and his subordinates who were on their way to raise the goddess Ammit from her dead were suddenly stopped by the Egyptian policemen. But since Harrow had become too powerful, he could take the souls of those policemen from their bodies easily. Surprisingly, Layla had been hiding in one of the cars that was used by Harrow and his subordinates. She prepared her knife and planned to kill Harrow right away, but suddenly the goddess Taweret took over one of the Egyptian policemen's bodies and stopped her. The goddess Taweret was aware that Harrow had become too powerful, so it was impossible for Layla to kill Harrow easily. Then, the goddess Taweret suggested Layla to release the god Khonshu instead so the god Khonshu could help Layla. Not long after that, Harrow and his subordinates arrived at the Pyramid of the Gods and the Goddesses. The gods and the goddess there tried to stop Harrow, but they failed to defeat Harrow, who had become too powerful. While Harrow and his subordinates were busy with themselves, Layla sneaked in that place to find and release the god Khonshu. After she found the statue of the god Khonshu, she broke that statue immediately. The god Khonshu finally freed from his imprisonment. At the same time, Harrow finally managed to unleash the goddess Ammit. After the goddess Ammit was unleashed, she asked Harrow to become her avatar. Not long after that, the god Khonshu came to that place and tried to fight the goddess Ammit. Because the god Khonshu was only alone, he was unable to fight the goddess Ammit. At the same time, the goddess Tauret saved Steven and Mark, who was running away from the sandstorm. Steven and Mark finally managed to enter the gates of Osiris and came back alive. The god Khonshu was being cornered by the goddess Ammit, but suddenly, he felt the presence of Mark there. Then, he looked for Mark and gave Mark his Moon Knight superpower back as soon as he found him. With the presence of Moon Knight, the god Khonshu believed that there was a little hope for them. Layla was still inside of the pyramid. She found one of the gods and the goddesses there. The god told her that they needed to lock the goddess Ammit up by trapping her inside of the body of her avatar. After that god said that, he finally died. To complete that mission, the goddess Taweret helped Layla by making Layla as her avatar. After that, Layla had officially become an avatar who had new look and superpower. Meanwhile, at the top of the pyramid, Harrow began to perform his ritual. He began to take the souls of people there from their bodies to make the goddess Ammit become more powerful. When Moon Knight saw that, he came and fought Harrow immediately. At the same time, the god Khonshu was fighting the goddess Ammit. Not long after that, Layla also came to that place to help Moon Knight. During that fierce battle, suddenly Mark lost his consciousness. As soon as he woke up, he realized that he had defeated Harrow. Mark and Steven were confused with that situation because they didn't remember that they had defeated Harrow. It meant that they had one more personality who had helped them defeating Harrow. After that, they took Harrow's body to the pyramid and performed a ritual to lock the goddess Ammit up. Because of that ritual, the goddess Ammit was sucked into and trapped inside of the body of her own avatar. Then, the god Khonshu asked Mark to kill Harrow to end all of this, but Mark refused to kill Harrow because he thought that he had completed his mission. He just wished to become an ordinary human being again. After the god Khonshu heard that, he finally granted what Mark wished. When Mark woke up from his sleep, he found himself lying in Steven's apartment. It meant that he had returned to his old life and stopped becoming an avatar of a god. Harrow was being taken by someone to a car. Inside of that car, Harrow saw the god Khonshu who was ready to kill him there. The god Khonshu had been waiting in that car with his new avatar called Jay. Jay was the third personality that had been created by Mark.